Here is what the famous writer Arthur Conan Doyle, who also studied unexplained phenomena, once said. "Over the years, I have received a large number of letters about things that cannot be fit into the framework of materialistic science. People write to me who have witnessed various manifestations of the other world. In these letters, they ask me for advice and explanations. And if I can give people the first, then there are problems with the second. These letters are stored in my card index in a box marked unknown. I use them to bring up for public discussion the topics touched upon in these messages." Not much is said about this interest of the writer today, but his contemporaries knew about it well. They sent Conan Doyle letters and described strange phenomena from their lives, asking the writer to explain them. And although Conan Doyle admitted that such correspondence took up too much of his time and energy, he believed that he was doing this work for a reason. Conan Doyle said that in this way he was fighting the inertia of his era and trying to get ahead of time by several centuries. According to Conan Doyle, many of the letters he received contained descriptions of meetings with manifestations of the other world. The writer believed that materialists would never admit the truth of such stories. But, according to Conan Doyle himself, these stories can only have two explanations. First, either a person who has a fairly good reputation, for some reason wants to ruin it for himself and goes to an aimless deception. Second, either everything this person says is the real truth, the writer noted. Mrs. Tweedale was one of such people. Thanks to her position in society and good reputation, Conan Doyle had no doubts about the honesty of this woman. As the writer was told, Mrs. Tweedale lived for some time in an old London house. One winter evening she dozed in her bed and was awakened by a sound that resembled the rustling of paper. Since there was no one else in the house, Mrs. Tweedale was alarmed by this sound. The woman opened her eyes and saw a man sitting in an armchair by the burning fireplace. He was wearing a military uniform that was worn in England during the time of the naval commander Horatio Nelson, who lived in the 18th century. The man was sitting by the fire and clutching a document in his hand. According to Mrs. Tweedale, the vision slowly disappeared before her eyes. Later, the woman saw this phenomenon more than once. Mrs. Tweedale decided to leave the house. The episode described suggests to me the idea that the man who appeared to Mrs. Tweedale had a will or some other important document in his hands. I can give this case only two acceptable explanations. Perhaps this man, who, judging by his uniform, lived in England 100 years ago, appeared to Mrs. Tweedale in the form of a spirit. It can also be assumed that, being in the other world, the spirit of this person is haunted by the thought of this document, and with his thoughts he calls his image in that room, explained Arthur Conan Doyle. The writer said that such a case is not at all isolated. And none of them can be explained logically either from the point of view of religion or from the point of view of physics. Conan Doyle was told about a similar episode by Miss Ray, who was visiting her relatives. There she was given a room that was often empty. At night, Miss Ray was awakened by some sound. The guest saw a faint glow in the middle of the room. In this glow there was a woman who was rushing around the room and was very excited about something. When Miss Ray described what had happened to her relatives in the morning, she was told that this woman had been seen at different times by other guests of the house. Arthur Conan Doyle submitted letters containing stories of a different kind for public discussion. The writer considered these stories more unusual in comparison with the cases described above. They contain evidence that indicates that a person's soul can leave the body for a while and then return to it. As an example, I would like to cite a very unusual letter. It was written by a woman who lives in Chicago. She wrote to me that last year she was between life and death. Although the doctors told her that at that moment she was unconscious, she could still hear music, the beauty of which was unlike that of the earth, see the faces of people dear to her who were no longer alive. These are the facts from the letter that Conan Doyle cited. The woman who wrote this letter called her visions the most real and amazing dreams she had ever seen. When she came to, she told the doctors with a smile that if this was death, then she was no longer afraid of the thought of the last day of life. This woman asked Conan Doyle if these visions could be visions of her soul, which had temporarily separated from her body. Conan Doyle said that he tried to find time to answer all such letters. He replied to this woman that he already had many messages confirming that temporary separation of the soul from the body is possible. And those who have experienced this no longer know the fear of death. In his response to this letter, Conan Doyle told a similar story. But in this situation, the separation of the soul from the body occurred not because of illness, but because of a strong emotional experience. This story was described to Conan Doyle in a letter by a woman who came to the opera house to listen to Enrico Caruso. During the opera, I was overwhelmed with feelings. At some point, it seemed to me that I soared upward. Some part of me separated from my body and looked at Caruso, rising above the audience. With difficulty I was able to force myself to return back. Opening my eyes, I saw a woman. She looked at me with horror. She told me that for several minutes I was unconscious, the woman wrote in her letter. Conan Doyle said that he had no reason not to believe the stories described. The writer tried to find a logical explanation for them. He said that such visions represent the wanderings of the ethereal body of a person, which can be seen. Conan Doyle assumed that if someone from the audience who came to listen to Caruso that evening raised his head up, then perhaps he would see something similar to what we call a ghost. And if the ethereal body of the man from South Carolina could not return back after traveling, doctors would record that this man died during his sleep. In some letters with similar content, I am told that sleeping people dream of lands of extraordinary beauty. Many of them consider these lands to be an invisible world where ethereal bodies live. For the sleeper, the places seen are as real as the earthly ones. The people they meet during these wanderings seem no less real to them. Personally, I have no doubt that such cases are connected with visions of another world where the ethereal body is transferred during sleep, concluded Conan Doyle. Unfortunately, the famous writer did not study these phenomena in depth, but only collected and stated the facts. Although all of them directly indicate that our life and the world around us are not at all what we are used to imagining.